Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a fascinating subject, these claims about prophecies concerning the prophet Muhammad.
Right. Prophecies supposedly found in, well, ancient texts like the Torah and the Bible, but also maybe in other places too. It's quite a complex area.
Definitely. And it can be, a bit controversial sometimes.
Exactly. It touches on religious history, textual interpretation, all that. We'll be looking closely at specific verses, historical accounts, and how different traditions have understood them.
And for this deep dive, we've got a really interesting stack of material bits from scholarly articles laying out these claims, some responses to listener questions we've had, and even a transcript from a history discussion.
All focused on interpreting these, let's call them potential signs or mentions.
Yeah, so our mission today really is to guide you through what these sources are saying. We want to explore the kinds of evidence they put forward, understand their interpretations.
And look at some of the big questions that top up when you dig into this material. We're basically here to highlight the most, well, interesting bits from these sources.
Okay, so first things first. One of the initial points these sources make is that the claims aren't just about the Torah and the Bible. It goes wider.
That's a really key point they stress right at the start. They broaden the scope quite a bit. For instance, they bring up the scrolls of Abraham, of Ibrahim.
Aren't around anymore, right?
Exactly. They're not extant. But the sources point out that the Quran itself mentions them, suggesting they contain descriptions, implying this idea of prophetic mentions goes way back, maybe even to Abraham.
Interesting. And the material also talks about scholars looking at specific old manuscripts.
Yes, like the Codex Curensis. It's a significant Hebrew Bible manuscript. And the sources suggest some scholars are examining it for, textual variations or older readings that might be relevant here.
And then there are texts showing early views on Islam.
Right. They mention things like the Arabic Apocalypse of Peter. It's a Christian text, and while maybe not a prophecy itself, the sources seem to use it to show the historical backdrop, how early Christians were seeing Arab rulers and Islam.
Okay. And the Gospel of Barnabas comes up too.
It does. It's non-canonical, not accepted by mainstream Christianity, but it's notable because the sources highlight that it explicitly names Muhammad.
Though its authenticity is heavily disputed.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
The sources acknowledge that dispute, but they include it as an example, however controversial, where the name actually appears in a text presented as Christian.
They even touch on some really speculative stuff, like interpretations from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, very speculative. Like maybe the Hebrew word atmak could somehow relate to Ahmad, another name for Muhammad. The sources mention it, but it's clear these are, tentative ideas.
Okay, but the real core of the argument in these sources, where they spend most of their energy, seems to be on specific texts within the Torah and the Bible.
Absolutely. That's where the detailed textual analysis comes in. And a verse that constantly pops up is Deuteronomy 18:18.
Let's hear it.
It's where God tells Moses, I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him.
Okay, from among their brethren, that phrase seems crucial for the interpretation in these sources.
It really is. The argument they make is this. If God meant another prophet from within the Israelites, like, say, Jesus, wouldn't the text say, from amongst yourselves or something similar?
Right.
So by saying, among their brethren, the sources interpret this as referring to a related people, but distinct from the Israelites themselves. Specifically, they argue it points to the descendants of Ishmael the Arabs.
Because Ishmael and Isaac were brothers, sons of Abraham, so their descendants are brethren nations.
Exactly. The Israelites are descendants of Isaac, the Arabs traditionally from Ishmael. So this interpretation sets the stage for arguing the prophecy points to Muhammad, an Arab, not Jesus, an Israelite.
And they don't stop there. They then compare the prophet described one like unto thee, meaning like Moses, to Muhammad and Jesus.
Yes, they draw out several points of comparison based on the life of Moses. They argue Muhammad fits the description like Moses better than Jesus does, according to their reading.
How so? What are the comparisons?
Well, first they point out that both Moses and Muhammad were born naturally, a normal human birth from a mother and father.
Okay, contrasted with the Christian account of Jesus's virgin birth.
Precisely. Then, both Moses and Muhammad married and had children, established families. Whereas the sources note Jesus remained unmarried.
Got it. What else?
A big one is law. Moses brought the law, a whole legal and social system. The sources argue Muhammad also brought a new comprehensive law, the Sharia.
And Jesus.
They argue Jesus in the Gospels is presented more as fulfilling the existing law of Moses, not bringing a completely new one to replace it.
Okay. That's a significant distinction they're drawing.
They also mention death. Both Moses and Muhammad died natural deaths and were buried. This is contrasted, again, with the Christian belief in Jesus' ascension.
In acceptance by their people.
Right. Moses and Muhammad, despite facing opposition, were ultimately accepted as leaders and prophets by their communities during their lifetimes, and their messages spread. The sources contrast this with Jesus facing rejection and, according to the Bible, being deserted by his disciples near the end.
And the leadership role.
Yeah, both Moses and Muhammad were prophets and rulers. They led armies, judged disputes, governed communities. The sources argue this prophet-statesman model fits Moses and Muhammad, but not Jesus' role as depicted in the Gospels.
So putting all those comparisons together is how the sources argue that Deuteronomy 18.18 points more closely to Muhammad.
That's the core of their argument on that verse,
Yeah.
and they link it to the very next verse, Deuteronomy 18.19.
What does that one say?
It's a warning. And it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words, which ye shall speak in my name, I will require it of him.
Speak in my name. How do they connect that?
They connect that phrase directly to the Islamic practice of starting nearly every Quranic chapter with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. They see this as a literal fulfillment, the prophet speaking God's words explicitly in God's name.
Okay, interesting connection there. Now, beyond the personal traits, the sources also seem to find prophecies related to where this prophet would come from, like geographic clues.
Yes, that's another fascinating angle they explore. They look at passages they believe point towards Arabia. Deuteronomy 33.2 is a key one here.
How does that one go?
He says, "The Lord came from Sinai and rose up from Seir unto them. He shined forth from Mount Purin."
Mount Purin, where do they place that?
The interpretation presented in these sources is that Mount Purin is in the vicinity of Mecca, in the Hijaz region of Arabia.
And how do they support that interpretation? What's the link?
They often connect it back to Genesis 21. Verses 14, 20, and 21 describe Hagar and Ishmael after leaving Abraham, dwelling in the wilderness of Paran.
So connecting the location mentioned in the prophecy, Haran, with the known settling place of Ishmael, the ancestor of the Arabs.
Exactly. That's the logic trail they follow. If Ishmael's descendants lived in Paran, and a prophecy mentions God shining forth from Paran, they link it to a prophet arising from Ishmael's descendants in that region.
Oh, okay. Are there other geographic links they point to?
Yes, they bring up passages from Isaiah quite a bit. For example, Isaiah 60, verses 2 through 8.
What does that section talk about?
It talks about light shining, Gentiles coming to the light, a multitude of camels covering the land, and significantly the flocks of Kedar ministering at the altar.
Kedar. Who is Kedar?
Kedar in the biblical genealogies is a son of Ishmael, and traditionally considered an ancestor of the North Arabian tribes, including the Quraysh Muhammad's tribe. The land associated with Kedar is generally placed in Arabia.
So the mention of Kedar, camels, flocks, pilgrimage, they connect all that to Mecca and the Hajj.
Precisely. They see it describing the universal message originating from that region, drawing people and wealth, specifically mentioning the people associated with Muhammad's lineage.
And you mentioned Isaiah 42 as well.
Right, Isaiah 42.1012. This passage calls for a new song, praise from the ends of the earth. It explicitly says, "Let the wilderness and the cities thereof lift up their voice, the villages that Kedar doth inhabit, let the inhabitants of the rocks sing."
Kedar again, and
Yeah.
singing, shouting praise from the wilderness and villages.
Yes. The sources interpret this as depicting the calls to prayer, the chanting of God's praise, like the Talbiyah during Hajj, resounding from the desert settlements and hills around Mecca, specifically mentioning Kedar's territory again. Places like Mina and Arafat, central to the Hajj pilgrimage near Mecca, fit this description in their view.
Wow, okay, that's quite specific. But perhaps the most striking textual connection the sources draw is the one about the prophet being illiterate.
That one often stands out, yes.
Hmm.
It's from Isaiah 29.1.
And it says,
It describes a situation where a book, or scroll, is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, "Read this, I pray thee." And he saith, "I am not learned."
I am not learned. How does that connect?
Well, the sources present this as an almost exact description of the traditional account of Muhammad receiving the very first revelation from the angel Gabriel in the cave of Hira.
The story where Gabriel says, Ikra, read.
Exactly. And Muhammad's famous reply, repeated multiple times according to the tradition, was "Ma'ana bikari," which translates essentially as, "I do not know how to read," or "I am not learned."
So the parallel between the verse in Isaiah and that foundational event in Islam is seen as very powerful evidence in these sources.
Very powerful, yes. They emphasize the specificity of that description.
And are there other, maybe less specific passages they mention? You hinted at Isaiah 41 and 42 earlier.
Yes. The sources also discuss broader themes in Isaiah, like in chapters 41 and 42, describing a chosen servant or prophet who will bring forth justice to the nations, who won't fail or be discouraged until he establishes justice on earth, who will be given as a covenant to the people, a light to the Gentiles.
Characteristics, they argue, fit Muhammad.
Right. They point to his role in establishing a new law or justice, the far-reaching impact of Islam, reaching the nations or Gentiles, the idea of God putting words in his mouth, the Quran, and his role as a leader or ruler who establishes this new order. They argue these descriptions align better with Muhammad's historical role than with Jesus's.
And just broadening out again for a second, the sources also mention, almost in passing, possible links beyond Abrahamic texts to India.
Yes, it's an intriguing side note they include. They mention claims or research suggesting that some ancient Indian scriptures, perhaps the Puranas or other texts, might contain descriptions that could be interpreted as referring to Muhammad.
With specific details.
The claims mentioned in the sources suggest potential matches for names, parents' names, companions, geographical pointers, things like that. It's presented as another area where foretelling might exist, suggesting the scope isn't limited just to the Bible or Torah.
Okay, so we've looked at the textual interpretations. Now, the sources also bring in what they see as historical evidence, right? Events and testimonies.
Absolutely. Moving from interpreting texts to historical accounts is a key part of their argument.
And one argument they make is kind of meta, that Muhammad claiming to be in those scriptures was itself significant.
Exactly. It's framed as a bold challenge. The sources argue, why would a person, especially someone seeking followers, make such a specific, easily checkable claim telling Jews and Christians, look in your own books, I'm foretold there, unless he was absolutely certain?
Because they could just check and call him out if it wasn't true.
Precisely. The sources point to verses in the Quran itself, like Surah 7.157 or 61.6, which explicitly state that the people of the book, Jews and Christians, would find Muhammad described in the scriptures they possessed, the Torah and the Gospel. Making this claim public is seen by the sources as a sign of confidence rooted in truth.
So did people actually check? The sources provide examples of people recognizing him based on their scriptures.
They do. They recount several historical episodes where individuals reportedly learned in Jewish or Christian texts are said to have recognized Muhammad as the prophesied figure.
Like who?
One major figure mentioned is Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor. The sources relate the story of him receiving a letter from Muhammad inviting him to Islam. Heraclius supposedly questioned Abu Sufyan, who was then an opponent of Muhammad, about the prophet's characteristics and lineage.
And what happened?
According to the account, Heraclius recognized that the descriptions matched what he knew from Byzantine scriptures about a coming prophet. He reportedly acknowledged this privately, saying something like, I knew he was going to appear, but I did not think he would be from among you Arabs. Political considerations, the sources suggest, prevented a public conversion.
Okay, an emperor. Who else?
The Negus, Ashama ibn Abajar, the Christian king of Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia. When Muslim refugees sought asylum there early in Islam, the Negus questioned them about their faith. They recited verses from the Quran about Jesus and Mary. The sources recount that the Negus was deeply moved, drew a line on the ground, and said something to the effect that the difference between what the Quran said about Jesus and what Jesus himself taught was no more than that line. He recognized the description as true based on his Christian understanding and granted the Muslims protection.
So recognition from Christian royalty based on the message itself. What about Jewish scholars?
Abdullah ibn Salam is a key example here. He was a very prominent and respected rabbi in Medina before Muhammad's arrival.
What's his story?
The sources say that when Muhammad arrived in Medina, Abdullah ibn Salam went to see him, asked him specific questions he believed only a prophet could answer, observed him, and immediately recognized the signs he knew from the Torah and declared his faith in Islam.
Immediately?
Yes, the accounts emphasize his immediate recognition. There's even a related story where Muhammad supposedly hid Abdullah and asked other Jewish leaders what they thought of him. They praised him highly. But when Muhammad revealed Abdullah had accepted Islam, they instantly denounced him. The sources present this as showing they knew his caliber, but rejected the truth when it challenged them.
And wasn't there a Christian relative of Muhammad's first wife involved early on?
Yes, Warqa ibn Nawfal. He was an elderly cousin of Khadija, known for his knowledge of Christian scriptures and tradition, possibly an Ebionite or Nestorian Christian.
And he played a role after the first revelation.
A crucial one, according to the sources. When Muhammad was shaken and uncertain after the experience in the cave of Hira, Khadijah took him to Warqa. Muhammad described what happened, the appearance of the angel.
What did Warqa say?
Warqa reportedly recognized the angel as the same Namus, lawgiver or angel Gabriel, who came to Moses. He immediately affirmed Muhammad's prophethood, saying, "This is the same one who keeps the secrets whom God sent to Moses." He also warned Muhammad that his own people would reject and expel him, just as previous prophets were rejected.
So immediate confirmation from someone knowledgeable in the prior scriptures, that's significant.
Very significant in the traditional narrative. Then there's the incredibly detailed story of Salman al-Farsi, Salman the Persian.
His story involves a long search, right?
A very long search for truth. He started as a Zoroastrian in Persia, then sought out Christian knowledge, traveling and studying under different monks.
And they guided him.
The last monk he was with, realizing he was dying, supposedly told Salman about the imminent appearance of a final prophet in the land of the Arabs. He gave Salman specific signs to look for.
What signs?
3 main signs, according to the sources. The prophet would accept gifts, but would not eat from charity given directly to him. He would have the seal of prophethood, a physical mark, between his shoulder blades, and he would arise in a land of palm trees.
So Salman traveled to Arabia looking for this.
Yes, he ended up enslaved, but eventually reached Medina. When Muhammad arrived, Salman tested him with these signs, offering dates as charity, which Muhammad gave away, then as a gift, which he accepted, and finally managing to see the seal of prophethood. Finding all 3 signs matched, Salman embraced Islam. His story is presented as a powerful testament to seeking and finding the prophesied one based on specific scriptural clues.
That's quite a narrative. Any other accounts of recognition, maybe from those who didn't convert?
Yes, the sources also include accounts like that of Safiya bint Huyai. She was the daughter of a prominent Jewish leader in Medina, Huyai ibn Akhtab, who fiercely opposed Muhammad.
And she became Muslim later.
Yes, she later married the prophet, but she recounted a childhood memory. When Muhammad first arrived in Medina, her father and her uncle went to see him. When they returned, she overheard her uncle ask her father, "Is he?" Meaning, is he the prophet foretold in their scriptures? Her father reportedly replied, "He is he, by God."
So they recognized him.
According to her account, yes. But then the uncle asked, "What then do you intend to do?" And her father replied, "To oppose him as long as I live." The sources use this to illustrate recognition followed by rejection, motivated by factors like tribal loyalty, jealousy, or loss of status, rather than lack of evidence.
Wow, that's a powerful story. And there was something about the general atmosphere in Medina, too.
Right. The sources mentioned that the Jewish tribes in Medina had apparently been anticipating a prophet's arrival for some time. They reportedly used to tell their pagan Arab neighbors, "A prophet is about to be sent. When he comes, we will follow him and kill you with his aid."
So the expectation was already there.
The expectation was known, and this, the sources suggest, actually primed some of the Medinan Arabs. When Muhammad arrived and they heard his message, they thought, "This must be the prophet the Jews have been warning us about," which contributed to their quick acceptance of Islam. There's even a specific anecdote about a young Medinan Arab named Salama ibn Waqsh recalling a Jew pointing towards Yemen, Mecca, and predicting a prophet's appearance from that direction years earlier.
So these historical accounts are presented alongside the textual interpretations as evidence.
Yes, and the sources sometimes add another layer, arguing about the reliability of these accounts themselves.
How so?
They sometimes argue that these historical reports, documented in the Hadith collections and Sirah biographical literature of Islam, have their own rigorous chains of transmission, is not.
Which they might claim are stronger or better preserved than the transmission history of the current versions of the Torah and Gospels. It's another dimension to their argument about evidence.
Exactly. It touches on the whole methodology of authenticating historical reports within the Islamic tradition versus other traditions.
Okay, so we've got the textual claims, the historical accounts of recognition, which naturally leads to the big question you mentioned earlier.
The unavoidable question, really.
If these prophecies exist as the sources claim, and if these historical figures genuinely recognize Muhammad based on them, why didn't the majority of Jews and Christians accept him? Why wasn't there widespread conversion then, or even historically?
It's the elephant in the room, and the sources dedicate significant attention to explaining this from their perspective. Their explanations tend to fall into a few key areas.
What's the first area?
It comes back to that point about source reliability and preservation we just touched on. The sources reiterate the Muslim belief in the divine preservation of the Quran. They often quote Surah 15.9, "Indeed, it is we who sent down the Quran, and indeed, we will be its guardian."
Contrasting that with the other scriptures.
Yes, they argue that, from their viewpoint, the earlier scriptures like the Torah and Gospels haven't had that same level of divine protection from change over the centuries. They point to issues like loss of original manuscripts, multiple translations causing shifts in meaning, scribal errors, and even intentional alterations.
So the argument is, if there's a conflict or ambiguity about a prophecy, the better preserved text, the Quran, and its accompanying tradition, the Sunnah, should be trusted.
That's essentially the argument regarding textual integrity. They believe the original message containing the prophecies was clearer, but it became obscured over time in the versions available later.
Which leads to the idea of deliberate changes.
Yes, that's a major explanation offered in the sources. They argue that over time, especially as Islam emerged as a distinct and rapidly growing religion challenging existing religious authorities, there were efforts within some parts of the Jewish and Christian communities to actively obscure or deny these prophecies.
How would they do that?
The sources suggest two main methods. First, obliteration or removal, simply deleting or omitting passages that were seen as too clearly pointing to an Arab prophet. They might cite historical figures like Ibn Taymiyyah, who claim to have seen different versions of texts like the Psalms, with some containing prophecies that were missing in others. They also point out that even the existing Bible mentions books or writings that are now lost, suggesting parts of the original corpus aren't available.
Okay, deletion. What's the second method?
Reinterpretation, or what's sometimes called tawil in Arabic theological terms. This means taking a prophecy that could point to Muhammad and deliberately explaining it away, twisting its meaning to apply to someone else, often Jesus, even if the fit isn't perfect according to the Muslim interpretation, or arguing it refers to something abstract, like the Holy Spirit, rather than a specific future prophet.
So explaining it away so it doesn't point where they don't want it to point.
Exactly. It's presented as a way to neutralize the prophetic claims without necessarily altering the text itself, just altering how it's understood and taught.
And why would people do this? What motives do the sources suggest?
Well, beyond sincere theological disagreement, which they acknowledge can exist, the sources also propose other, more worldly motivations. Things like protecting established religious authority, maintaining social status and leadership within their communities, perhaps fear of losing followers or influence.
So not just about truth, but also about power and position.
Some sources frame it quite starkly, posing the question: was the resistance purely about religious differences, or was it partly about preserving existing power structures and avoiding the nullification of their own religious framework by accepting a later prophet? It suggests a complex mix of potential motives.
Can you give an example of this kind of reinterpretation they talk about?
A classic example often brought up in these sources is the word paraclete, or parakletos in Greek, from the Gospel of John. Jesus promises God will send another paraclete after him.
Which is usually translated as comforter, advocate, or helper, often referring to the Holy Spirit in Christian theology.
Right, but the sources point to arguments made by some scholars and converts, like Abdul Ahad Dawood, who was a Catholic priest before converting, suggesting that the original Greek word might have actually been parakletos, not parakletos.
And what does parakletos mean?
It means the praised one, or the illustrious one.
Which is very close in meaning, too.
To Ahmad, which is another name for Muhammad, also meaning the most praised. So the argument presented is that the original word might have directly alluded to Muhammad's name or description, but through either a scribal error or deliberate choice in transcription or translation, it became parakletos, allowing for the interpretation as the Holy Spirit.
So this paraclete debate is used as a prime example of how a potential prophecy could have been diverted or reinterpreted over time.
Exactly. It serves as a case study for the kind of textual or interpretive shifts the sources claim might have happened.
But despite all these arguments about why prophecies might have been ignored or obscured, the sources also stress that not everyone missed them. They circle back to the converts.
Yes, they make a point of countering the idea of universal rejection by highlighting again those individuals from Jewish and Christian backgrounds who did convert and specifically wrote about finding prophecies of Muhammad in their own former scriptures.
Remind us of some of those names again.
They re-mention figures like Samuel al-Maghribi, the 12th century Jewish scholar from Baghdad, whose book Ifham al-Yahud, Confutation of the Jews, detailed prophecies he found in the Torah, and Abdullah al-Turjuman, a 14th century Christian priest from Majorca who wrote Tufag al-Arib fi Arad al-Salib, the gift to the intelligent for refuting the arguments of the Christians, also citing scriptural evidence he believed pointed to Muhammad.
And the more modern ones.
People like Abdullah Ahad Dawood, formerly Reverend David Benjamin Kildani, whose book Muhammad in the Bible makes detailed arguments. Also names like Ibrahim Khalil Phillips, formerly an Egyptian Coptic Christian, and Ahmad Hijazi al-Saka, another Egyptian scholar who wrote extensively comparing texts.
So the testimonies of these converts are presented as crucial evidence, people from within those traditions saying, yes, the signs were there.
Precisely. Their writings and conversions are used in the sources as confirmation that the prophecies were indeed recognizable within the texts, even if interpretations varied or were later contested.
Okay, we have definitely covered a lot of ground today. A real deep dive into these sources and their claims about prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad.
We've looked at how they interpret specific verses, particularly in the Torah and Bible, but also touching on possibilities in other ancient traditions.
And we explored the historical accounts they present, stories of recognition from emperors, kings, scholars, and ordinary people seeking truth.
And then we tackled that complex question of belief and non-belief, looking at the explanations these sources offer, focusing on textual preservation, alleged alterations or reinterpretations, and the mix of human motivations involved.
It really highlights a core tension presented in this material. On one hand, a strong case built from textual readings and historical anecdotes, arguing for fulfilled prophecy.
And on the other hand, an explanation for resistance and rejection based on arguments about textual changes over time and the complexities of human power, authority, and belief systems.
So, as you think about everything we've discussed from these sources today, here's a final thought to maybe mull over. Consider the claim made within these sources that efforts were undertaken over time to deliberately hide, remove, or reinterpret information pointing to a specific prophecy.
If, hypothetically, such attempts were actually made, what might that imply? Does the very act of trying to suppress or change a message inadvertently suggest that the message itself was seen as powerful, significant, maybe even true by those trying to hide it?
It raises some really deep questions, doesn't it, about how history gets written, how knowledge is passed down or obscured, and that constant interplay between faith, evidence, historical context, and, well, human nature itself. Something to definitely keep thinking about.